He's after your Lucky Charms. Any boss who's immune to the elemental damage will not be immune to the physical damage. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Good howdy, everybody. This is the P90
Holographic meatloaf? My favorite!
There's two different ways that you can do this build. One is the very simple, I have a full-time job build, and the other is the I want to be the ultimate sweat lord and make sure that everybody in the world knows how good my DPS is build. These are two very different builds, and they play similarly enough, but they could be better. We're going to go over the armor for each build. We're going to go over the calibrations for each build and why they matter and why they're different. Let's get right into it. This is a brand new gun. Just dropped today at the time of recording this with the new Lunar Season 2 Revelry now available. The P90 has a very neat effect. It's a bullseye gun, except it does AoE damage equal to 800% of your attack to nearby enemies within 8 meters. That is a huge, huge explosion. That's bigger than Unstable Bomber. That's about the size of Kumawink's bounce. It is very, very powerful. When you hit a target with the AoE, you reload 3% of your ammo up to 15%. So if there's 5 enemies, you reload the maximum amount. There's kind of a break point there. If you have about 106, 107 bullets in your magazine, you'll be able to actually have infinite ammo every time the explosion triggers. It's very powerful, and in the right AoE setting can be even more powerful than it already is naturally. It's very good at both single target and AoE. And then when you mark an enemy with bullseye, you get an extra 20% crit rate, which is extremely high. Very, very powerful. Because this gives you an extra 20% crit rate, you want to use the recurve crossbow in your secondary slot to give you an extra 15%. And then if you have the kukri, that is another extra 15%, which means you have, with these 3 weapons alone, a 50% crit rate. That is insanity. To naturally have a 50% crit rate is absolutely insane. Out of combat with the weapon in my hand, I have passively a 28% crit rate. I do 177 crit damage, 30% weak spot damage. I do 30% additional crit damage against targets with the bullseye, an extra 43% crit damage against targets with the bullseye, and then an extra 30% weak spot damage against targets with the bullseye. This does matter because the explosion deals weak spot damage, and it can crit as well. So it scales with all 3, your weapon damage, your weak spot damage, and your critical damage. I focus on weapon damage and critical damage, but a weak spot is nice too. And then my weapon damage bonus is passively 133%, which is very high. This mostly comes from the 3 pieces of treacherous tides that I use, which gives me a 12% weapon damage bonus and then an additional 28% weapon damage bonus as my health gets low. I'm also using 2 pieces of lone wolf to raise my magazine capacity and increase my critical rate. For my key item, I'm using the brand new bloodstained tracker boots. So whenever I apply bullseye on someone who's already marked, it will give me a 20% damage increase and trigger bullseye on a nearby enemy, which is tremendously powerful. Now let's go over the calibrations and the full-time job version of the build. The calibration of heavy style with double crit rate. You can use energy style because it will give you an extra 10% attack damage with double crit rate, and that's really cool too. If you use heavy style, you can just hold down left trigger for longer, and double crit rate will make sure that you do more damage output without having to do a crazy combination of inputs. You don't got to use the recurve bow, you don't got to use the kukri. You'll be fine. It is the full-time job version of this build to just use 3 pieces of savior gear, 2 pieces of lone wolf, and those new bloodstained boots key item. That is going to be your absolute go-to because otherwise it's not going to actually give you the most benefit. This is a really passive way to play. You're not going to have the same DPS, but it'll be close because treacherous tides is about having low HP. Savior is about draining your HP to give you shield to give you more damage. And the higher the shield is, the more your damage is, etc. It just keeps cycling like that. You can combine the two, but that's a different thing. It's really just a matter of being able to passively output a ton of damage with this gun. You'll do the best at that with using heavy calibration, with double crit rate, 3 pieces of savior, 2 pieces of lone wolf, and your key item. For my mods, I'm using vulnerability amplifier. Since this is the main way that we're going to spread vulnerability, this one should be using the amplifier. I rolled weak spot damage and duration. Those are the 2 that I think you want. I don't think proc chance matters because you're going to proc it every 12 bullets easily. There will never be a time that you don't. So I want duration. Ideally, I'd have crit damage, but weak spot damage is still good. On my secondary, I'm also using vulnerability amplifier. It doesn't really matter what mod you have on here. If you had to use anything other than amplifier, I would use recovery mark. On the melee weapon, the mod you want to use is... Moving on to our armor, I am using momentum up. So you get down the magazine much faster, which means you get your 12 bullets faster, which means you get your proc faster. And then as your magazine gets lower, you gain increased damage. These 2 things are synchronous. They both
wow. Hey, sorry guys. So about that. Yeah, that's cool. Momentum up works, but have you seen Fateful Strike? If your crit damage is not really the highest and your crit chance feels a little bit low, just use Fateful Strike. Sure, you can't do any more weak spot damage, but it gives you a lot more crit chance and crit damage, which is fantastic because this gun really relies on the crit damage. Look, I'm just saying, man, give it a try. Bye. All right, anyway.
I'm using Lunar to increase my crit damage and weapon damage. And now that Lunar is active again, you can actually farm Lunar mods like crazy now. For my mask, I'm using Targeted Strike, more crit rate, more crit damage. I'm using the Suffix mod to give me more crit damage, and ideally I'd have more duration, but this is okay too. You cannot roll weapon damage on a bullseye mod. For my chest piece, I'm using my strongest Lunar. In this case, it's Enduring Shield. So I gain crit damage, weapon damage, and great ones as my health gets lower. For my pants, I'm using Deadshot. Every time I crit, I gain more crit damage up to 45. Super strong. Again, this is one that I'm focusing on crit damage and weapon damage, so violent. Gloves, crit boost to give me crit damage and weapon damage via the violent suffix. On my boots, I'm using Rush Hour. As my health gets lower, my damage gets higher. Once more, violent. For my cradle, I am using Anti-Phase to give me more SMG damage. Rapid Aid, so I can aid myself rapidly. Resilience, so that my shield takes reduced damage from monsters. Deviant Energy Defense, to give me a shield when I summon my deviation. This will help us survive since we're low HP. Tactical Combo, whenever I do reload, I gain weapon damage. Very useful. Marked Strike. Weak spot damage against targets with the bullseye is really powerful because, again, the explosion was weak spot damage, so this will still buff us. Bounty Hunter, because we do the marking, therefore we do the sharking. What does that even mean? I'm sticking with it though. That's so dumb. God, I love it. Ay, ay, ay. For our deviation, we are using Lone Wolf's Whisper Lunar Oracle. This has a native trait that gives us 5% increased weapon damage, multiplying by 1.5 times when below 30% sanity. We're always low sanity, therefore it's powerful. The best Lone Wolf's Whisper Lunar Oracle you can get will come with Crack Shot. The Crack Shot trait will give you additional damage. It's very powerful. Additionally, whenever the puppy decides to bite something, you will do 50% increased weapon damage. Your gun does weapon damage, so it does more damage. It's really powerful. It's good. For our food buffs, Mixed Fried Hot Dog is going to give us increased damage against targets affected by bullseye. Since enemies are always affected by bullseye, that's just a damage buff, baby. Easy peasy. Now there's 2 different foods you can use as well if you're running Chef. Crumbly Bread is a strong secondary. 32% increased weapon damage is very powerful. Additionally, Bone-In Deviated Sausage, if you're killing bosses specifically, will raise your damage against bosses by 20%. So Crumbly Bread is better for all-around general gameplay as your secondary food, but Bone-In Deviated Sausage is also very powerful. If you really want to stack the crit damage, Stargazy Pie works as well. That's going to be a 32% critical damage boost when it's fully buffed. The main thing being, boosting your critical damage does have a diminishing return if you do not have increased weapon damage to boost it by. So you can have 400% increased crit damage, but if you're only critting for 1,000, the main way you're going to raise your crit damage is by increasing your weapon damage, if that makes sense. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see any other specific type of build, leave it in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do the whole big 3. Helps out the channel a whole bunch. We are live on Twitch, 7:30 PST every day. We will be there, except for Wednesdays. They're bad days. We don't like them. And as always, the bathhouse provides.